Yeah, it's all right. We'll say good morning. Let's begin. So we left off. Today's daf is paid Dalid. Today's daf is paid Dalid. We left off on paid Gimel Amud Beis. So we'll say, if you remember again, we're trying to figure out. The Mishnah told us that Lemaisa, when you go ahead and you offer up the carbon Pesach, anything that's left over, no sir, anything else, cannot be burned on the first day Yom Tov, but rather instead is deferred to be burned until the first day of Chol HaMoed, the 16th of Nisan. So we're trying to figure out exactly why that is. So we left off 2 lines up from the bottom. Rava Amar. Rava says, this is Pei Gimel Amud Beis. Rava Amar. Rava said, Amar Kra, the pasuk says, Hu levado yeyaseh lochem. It by itself shall be done for you. Now I will say this pasuk is talking about over here Ochel Nefesh. So we know that one of the interesting distinctions between Shabbos and Yom Tov is that Lemaisa on Yom Tov you are permitted to engage in activities that are necessary for food preparation. So you can go ahead and Pei Gimel Amud Beis last 2 lines. You can go ahead and you can cook, and you could do many, like we know, you could do many things in order to allow for food preparation. So Rava says the following: the Torah says, "Hu levado yaseh lochem." It's dafka food preparation activities that may be done for you. Hu velo machshirav. So that teaches us that only direct food preparation activities, but not preparatory activities, can be done. What does that mean? So, for example, the classic example of this is, I can't sharpen my knife on Yom Tov. Meaning I could shecht on Yom Tov, but I can't go ahead and sharpen the knife because sharpening the knife is what we call a food preparatory activity. So that secondary type of activity can be done before Yom Tov, and therefore may not be done on Yom Tov itself. The most contemporary application of this for us is, let's say, lighting a fire. Lighting a fire, technically speaking, is necessary for cooking, but because the fire could have been lit before Yom Tov, that's called machshirim. And then for the Maisa, we don't light a new flame. I mean, we take a flame from a pre-existing flame, but we don't create a flame from nothing on Yom Tov. So the Gemara says, top levado, we learn from the pasuk of the word levado by itself, top of Pei Dalet, below mila shelo b'zmana. So we'll say levado teaches us that meaning only cooking could be done on Yom Tov, but not a mila shelo b'zmana. What's a mila shelo b'zmana? That once the 8th day passes, whether again it's because the father was derelict in his responsibilities, or because, let's say, the child was ill. So a milah shelo b'zmana cannot be done on Yom Tov. Now I will say, why would I have thought a milah shelo b'zmana can be done by Yom Tov? Because Rashi Gemara says over here, haba mikal v'chomer. See, well, so we actually had this earlier. What's the kal v'chomer? The kal v'chomer is like this. The kal v'chomer is avoda in the Beis Hamikdash is docha Shabbos. Tsaras is docha avoda. Because remember again, so you could do the avodah even though it entails malacha on Shabbos. Saras, if a kohen gets saras, that precludes him from doing the avodah. And mila is docha saras. What does that mean? That if the child has saras on the makom mila, on the place of the circumcision, remember, see, under normal circumstances, it will say you can't cut off your saras. But if saras is on the makom mila, you can cut off the saras. So working backwards, I would have said, therefore, what? If Mila is docha tsaras, and tsaras is docha avoda, and avoda is docha Shabbos, then if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C, and therefore what? Therefore Mila, even shelo b'zmana, is docha Shabbos. I could have made that particular argument. So the Gemara says, Levado teaches you that no, it's only things that are clearly have to be done on this day, which are docha Yom Tov, but a Mila shelo b'zmana, which does not have to be done on this day, is not docha Yom Tov. And we'll say, why is this important for us? Because Mila shelo b'zmana becomes the paradigmatic case of things that don't have to be done today. What's another example of something that doesn't have to be done today? If I have leftover for my Karban Pesach, it doesn't have to be burned today. It can be burned the next day. Once something does not have to be done on Yom Tov, then by definition, the dispensation of Ochel Nefesh does not cover it. Rav Ashi says, Shabbason di Yom Tov asehu ve'ein aseh docha lo saseh v'aseh. Rav Ashi turns this whole thing on. Rav Ashi says like this: the whole reason you wanted to say that we should burn the leftover of the carbon on the first day Yom Tov was why? Because the burning of the leftover of the carbon is a mitzvahs aseh by ish tisrofu, and the prohibition to malachas lo saseh is the prohibition. So he said that Lamaisa, the aseh, the positive commandment, should set aside the prohibition. Rav Ashi comes along and says, 1 second, Yom Tov is not just simply a prohibition. Yom Tov actually has associated with it in aseh a positive commandment, as well as a lo saseh, as well as a prohibition. Therefore, Lamaisa, the Gemara says that this is why Yom Tov is stronger than the obligation to burn the carbon. Because the obligation to burn the carbon is just a positive commandment, versus, again, Yom Tov, which has a positive commandment and a prohibition. Whenever you have a positive commandment and a prohibition coming up just against the positive commandment, the positive commandment and prohibition will trump everything else, and therefore we don't burn the leftover Karban Pesach on Yom Tov itself, but instead, when do we burn the leftovers? We wait until the first day of Chol HaMoed, the 16th of Nisan. Says the Mishnah. So we'll say, now again, we began this discussion in the last Mishnah. If you remember, it's important to know which parts of the animal count as food. Because remember, when figuring out, when you have a chabur, when you have a group that's on a particular Karban Pesach, you can't just, it's nice to be a generous person, but you have to make sure that you have at least a kizayis of meat for every person who is a member of that Karban Pesach group. So therefore, in order to do that, you have to know what counts as food, what doesn't count as food. So the Gemara says like this, the Mishnah says, Kol ha'ne'echal b'shar ha'godol yochol b'gdiarach. Whatever part of a mature ox is edible, those are the same parts that will be edible in a young gedi, in a young kid. So what that means is essentially what the Gemara Mishnah is saying. The Gemara will clarify this, but the Mishnah is saying over here that when we look at what's edible, we look at what will be edible in the full mature state of the animal. Furthermore, it says in the Mishnah, the ends of the shoulder blades, and the cartilage is also considered to be part of the edible part of the animal. Says the Gemara, Rabba Ramitanan. Rabba contrasts the two statements. On one hand, it says Tanan, anything that's edible in a large mature ox will be edible, is considered food within literally the soft kid, which means the young kid. But obviously that which is not edible in a fully mature ox cannot be consumed in the small kid. What about Ema Seifa? What about the end of the Mishnah that says, Rashi cannot find the ends of the shoulder blades, Vasachusim, and the cartilage, Vahahani Lomis Achli Bishar Godel. But these particular items, the end of the shoulder blades and the cartilage, these are not edible parts of a large mature ox. So we'll say we seem to be contradicting ourselves. On one hand, you're telling me that whatever is edible in the ox, is considered edible even in the young kid, and now you're giving me two examples of things that are not edible in a large ox. To which the Gemara says, Ela Tanahi. In reality, it's machlokes tanoim. V'hachi katone, and this is what it means to say, Kol ha'ne'echal b'shar ha'gadol yochal b'gedi harach. Anything that is edible in a large cow, in a large ox, is edible in a young gedi, a young kid. V'she'enu ne'echal lo. But anything that is not edible within the large ox is not considered to be edible within the young calf. Now, I want to be clear on something. What that means is, even if right now it's technically edible as part of the kid, because it will become a part that is not edible, therefore it can't be counted as part of the consumable part of the karban. V'yesh omrim, and others say no. Af rashi knafayim v'asachusim. And others say no, even the ends of the shoulder blades and the cartilage is considered to be an edible part of the animal. And I will say, why is that? How could they be considered an edible part of the animal if they're not really edible? Look at Rashi. First Rashi in the Gemara. V'yesh omrim af rashi knafayim v'asachusim hoil ubishar hagodol gufei misachlo b'shlika b'shel yoser. They can be made edible. How could they be made edible? Through intensive, long cooking. So since, again, technically speaking, it can be rendered edible, therefore even in the young kid, it's edible as well. Rava Amar Rava says, Mahin Katoni. Mahin Rabosai means is a stylistic approach of the Mishnah. Mahin literally means what are they? What does that mean? Vachi Katoni, this is how the Mishnah is supposed to read. Kala ne'achal b'shara godol b'shilka, yochal b'gedi harach b'tzli. Whatever can be eaten from the large calf through excessive cooking and boiling, can be eaten in the young kid through roasting. Umahin, what's an example of something that could only be eaten in a large ox through excessive cooking, but by a gedi can be rendered fit for consumption even just through roasting? Rashi knafayim v'asechusim. An example of that would be the end of the shoulder blades and the cartilage. Tanya kavase dirab. We have a brisa that supports Rava's approach. What does the Bride say? Anything that can be eaten from a large ox through excessive cooking can be eaten in the young kid through roasting. Umahin, what's an example of this? Roshi knafayim v'asechusim. An example of this is the ends of the shoulder blades as well as the cartilage. The gidin harakin. What about soft sinews? We began to speak about the sinews as well. So again, this is all very important because understand, you, like we said before, you need to account for every piece of every edible part of the carbon. Because the pashtus, remember, ideally you didn't really want leftovers. And the truth is, you really want to make sure that every part of the carbon was utilized. So to know what can be eaten, what can't be eaten is very important. The gidin harakin. What about soft sinews? Nidonin kibasar. These are treated like meat. So the Gemara says, but one second, itmar. Let's analyze this for just a moment. Gidin shesof and lahakshos. I will say, if you have sinews that ultimately will harden. So I guess there are certain things. And remember, Karban Pesach was only brought from an animal that was within its first year of life, which means that what the Gemara is always struggling with over here is there are certain parts of that animal now that are soft or that are edible, like we saw with the cartilage and the end of the shoulder blades, that later on will not be edible. So the shaila is, how do you deal with that? Do we look? Well, we'll see this later on more explicitly. But do we count it as food based on what it is right now, or do we look what it's going to become? So the Gemara says, for example, you could have sinews that right now may be soft, but sof on the hakshos, they're going to get hard. Rabbi Yochanan says, nimnin alin bepesach. Rabbi Yochanan says that no, they count as food, and literally you could assign someone that portion on Pesach. Reish Lakish says, nimnin alin bepesach. No, they don't. You can't. Nimna means you can't be counted on. There's another way of saying you can't assign that portion to someone on Pesach. Rabbi Yochanan says that you could assign the soft sinews that will later on turn hard to someone for a portion on Pesach. Why? Basar hashta azlinon. We look at what it is now. Right now, is it edible? The answer is yes. Therefore what? Therefore it's food. Therefore you could assign someone. Rish Lakish says no. We can't assign that portion to someone. Why? Basar besof azlinon. Because ultimately we look at what it's going to become. So the Gemara says, Rish Lakish raises a kash against Rabbi Yochanan. Kol hanecha b'shara gadol yochol b'gdi harach. So what does the Mishnah say? The Mishnah says anything that could be eaten as part of a large ox could also be eaten in the young kid. Umahin, what's an example of this? Roshei knafayim v'asachusim, the end of the shoulder blades, and cartilage. Honey in. So apparently what the Mishnah is saying is these things can be eaten. Aval gidin shesofan lahakshos lo. But we can infer from the Mishnah that what? That sinews that will become hard may not be consumed. And therefore, what do you see from here? That when determining if a particular part of the animal is considered to be food or not, what do, Rabbi Osai? We don't simply look at what is now. We look rather at what it will become. So Amarlei, Rabbi Yochanan responds, Tana honey v'hu adin lahanach. So Rabbi Yochanan will respond, no. What the Mishnah means to say is it includes the end of the shoulder blades and the cartilage, and also sinews that ultimately will become hard. Meaning, so what Rabbi Yochanan is saying is that Lamaisa, the Mishnah is not going to list every single part of the animal that ultimately is edible, but once it says the shoulder blades and the cartilage, which are things that can be, that ultimately are edible now, then Lamaisa, again, that indicates that it applies to the Gidin as well. So the Gemara says, Hani my taima, why is it that you could go ahead and count the end of the shoulder blades as well as the cartilage as food? Because like we said before, Abba say they can be rendered fit for consumption through cooking. Hanach nami misachli b'shar gadol b'shilka. These gidin, even once they harden, can also be rendered fit for consumption through cooking. Amar li Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabbi Abin. So also Rabbi Yirmiyah said to Rabbi Abin the following. He said to Rabbi the following. Ki azlas l'kamid Rabbi Avo. When you come before Rabbi Avo, Rami lay, ask him the following question. Mi amar Rabbi Yochanan gidin shesofen lahakshos nimna alein bepesach. Did Rabbi Yochanan really say that sinews that are going to get hard and therefore unedible could still be counted, inedible, could still be counted as food for Karban Pesach? Alma basar hashta azlinon. What do we see from there? That if Rabbi Yochanan indeed holds that Rabbi Yochanan determines the status of any particular item based on its present circumstances. But we learned, but yet, Rish Lakish asked the Rabbi Yochanan the following question: Or harosh shel egel harach, literally the hide the hide of the head of a young calf, mahu sheyitame. Is it capable of becoming tummy? They're both saying, here's the issue. Apparently, in a young calf, the hide of the head is soft enough that it can be eaten. So what the question is like this, but yeah, we know that as the calf gets older, that hide hardens and it's no longer edible. So the shaila is now, you shech the calf, you have the hide of the head, it's soft, it's edible. Is that receptive to tumas ochlin? Foods can become tamei. Is that receptive to tumas ochlin, or do we say what? Or do we say that really, since it's not going to be ochel down the road, therefore the ma'isa, it's not receptive to tumas ochlin? So Reish Lakish asked this question to Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Yochanan said, "Va'amar lo ein metame." And Rabbi Yochanan says it doesn't become tamei. What do you see from there? Alma basar sofas linan. So Rabbi will say, what do you see from that? You see that lemaisa. Rabbi Yochanan does not look at the present circumstance of the individual, but Rabbi Yochanan does look at what the item will become. Amarle, so he responded, whoever said this to you literally did not properly grind his flour. I will say that was a major rabbinic insult, which means that you don't think about what you say before you say it. Just like, again, somebody wasn't careful when they ground their flour, the flour would come out pieces. So to say that you didn't really think about, you're not really careful with what you're relaying, you didn't really ground your flour properly. Because Rabbi Yochanan retracted this position to Reish Lakish. And he said, Al takniteni, don't challenge me over this. Shebi lashon yochid anishona osa. Because I recognize that the position that I said before was a das yochid, was a minority approach. So in other words, what the Gemara was saying over here is, yes, Rabbi Yochanan had originally said that we look at the future status of a particular individual, but then he retracted that particular stance and instead adopted his current stance that we look at the current matzah, the current status of a particular item in terms of determining its halachic status. So Rabbi say, so now we have, so this is the fundamental of Rabbi Yochanan. How do we pass? Meaning, I will say, this is actually very important. This is very important. Legabe carbon pesach. So first of all, in terms of the shor hagadol, the way we paskin is in the first part is anything that is edible in a large mature calf, even through excessive boiling, because you have to cook it a lot, is considered to be edible in a young kid. That's part number one. That's how we paskin. Number two, we actually paskin like Reish Lakish, who says that gidin shesof and lahakshos, that if something is edible now but it's going to become inedible, we pass like Reish Lakish that is not counted as a piece of meat, as a part of the carbon that's consumable. So on one hand, again, we say that as long as an object can be rendered edible, even through excessive cooking, it's considered food. On the other hand, we don't just look at the parts of the animal for what they are now, in terms of assessing whether or not they're part of the Korban Pesach, we look at what they will become as well. Says the Mishnah, somebody breaks a bone in a kosher and a tar Korban Pesach. Well, so we spoke about breaking bones yesterday. Torah tells us that when you eat the Korban Pesach, you may not break a bone. So let's say you went ahead and you broke a bone. So what's the halacha? You get 40 lashes. You violated the law. Okay. Aval hamos siritar. But if you leave over part of the carbon, meaning no sir, you leave over part of, you don't finish the Korban Pesach, or hashover b'tamei, or you break the bone of a Korban Pesach that's tamei. So both say in these cases 2 and 3 over here in the Mishnah, so you also violated something. You left over. You're not allowed really to leave over, or you right. But again, we'll see why you don't get malchus for that. Or if you break a bone, in a carbon that's tamei, that's tamei, you also don't get malchus. Says the Gemara, I understand why if you leave over some of the Korban Pesach that you're not chayiv malchus. Why? Disanya lo so siru mimenu ad boker. Because what does the Torah say? You may not leave over from it until the morning, and that which is left over from it until the morning shall be burnt in the fire. So also Rabbi Yehuda says like this. The way the Torah phrases this prohibition is, it's a negative statement followed by a positive statement. Whenever a negative statement is followed by a positive statement, it's telling you that it's prohibited, but what? But if you violate it, you will not get malchus. You won't get lashes. That's Rabbi Yehuda's position. Rabbi Yaakov says, no, lo min Hashem uzeh, that's not right. Ella mishum dahavile lav she'in bo ma'isa. V'chol lav she'in bo ma'isa in lokin alav. So we'll say, Rabbi Yaakov says it's a much more fundamental issue. We'll say, when do you get malchus? When you violate a prohibition that is violated through an active prohibition. But if you violated something through passivity, it's aser, it's an aveira, but you don't get malchus for that. You don't get malchus for that. So the Gemara says, but how do I know that if I break the bone of a Korban Pesach, that's telling me that I don't get malchus? The Amar Kran, because the pasuk says, "Ve'etzem lo tishperu bo." You may not break a bone in it. Bo b'kasher v'lo b'pasel. Bo comes to teach me in it, meaning I'm only obligated for breaking a bone in a kosher Pesach, but not obligated for breaking a bone in a pasel Pesach. Rabbi says, "B'bayis echad ye'achel." You shall eat the Korban Pesach in one home. Ve'etzem lo tishperu bo. And you may not break a bone. So the Rebbe notes the juxtaposition between these two concepts and says, Kol ha'ro'ui la'achila yesh bo mishum shviras etzem. Whatever is fit for consumption, that's subject to the laws of shviras etzem. V'she'ein ro'i la'achila ein bo mishum shviras etzem. But ultimately, anything that's not permitted for consumption is not subject to the prohibition of breaking the bone. I will say, so what we have over here essentially are two different opinions. Meaning everybody's agreeing that you're not chayiv malchus for breaking a bone, or you're not violation of law for breaking a bone of a Korban Pesach that's tummy. The shaila is, how do we know that? So the first opinion said because you're only chayiv for breaking a bone in a Korban Pesach that is kosher. Bo, etzem tishmeru bo. Bo means only a carbon that's kosher. The second opinion says, same idea, I agree. You're also not obligated for breaking a bone in a Korban Pesach that's possible, but why? Because the Torah says only a Korban Pesach that's fit for consumption. That's right, la'achila is subject to the prohibition of breaking the bone. It's not subject, not Roy Lachila, is not subject to the prohibition. So one says that so therefore when I come to my case over here of breaking a bone in a Korban Pesach, that's Tameh. So both will agree that I'm not chayav for that. One will say because it's not Roy Lachila, I can't consume it. And others will say because it's not a carbon kosher. So the Gemara says, my benayu, is there some kind of practical difference between these two opinions? Rabbi Yirmiyah, yes, Rabbi Yirmiyah says the following, Pesach haba b'tumah ika benayu. You know what the practical difference is? But so we already learned extensively that Lamaisef, the majority of the Jewish people are Tameh. So what do? We go ahead, everybody brings a Korban Pesach in a state of Tumah. The laws of Tumah are not set aside, but are set aside, and we bring the Korban Pesach b'Tumah. So the Gemara says, Laman do Amar Kosher Amavez. According to Laman who says that the only time a Korban Pesach is subject to the laws or to the prohibition of breaking a bone is when it's kosher. Ha-Pasel. The truth is, Rabbi said, this is a carbon puzzle. This is a carbon that's being brought in a state of tumah. Because remember, how do we paskin? We paskin that tumah is dechuya b'tzibor, not huchra b'tzibor. Therefore, again, this carbon is really puzzle. But what? There's a special dispensation that says that it's acceptable. But according to Mandam, who says that any carbon that is roi lachila is subject to the prohibition of breaking the bone, then what? Hanami roi lachilahu. This carbon, in fact, is roi lachila. Rav Yosef says no. Everyone agrees, Rabbosai, that Lemaisa, in this kind of circumstance, everyone agrees that the Korban Pesach is not subject to the prohibition of breaking the bone. Why? The Rebbe la'akulo hu da'asi, ka'asi. Because Rebbe's coming to give a kula. So the Gemara says, V'hai ha'pasulhu, ela haisalosh, v'hai ha'pasulhu, ela haisalosh shasa kosher, v'nifsal ika b'nei. Rather says the Gemara, here's the nafkamina between the two opinions. If let's say the carbon was permitted, had a time at which it was consumable, and now what? And now it became possible. Leman do amar. So we'll say, so for example, the simplest example of that is what? Is the Korban Pesach the next morning. Right? Well, let's say again, now comes the next morning of Pesach, or comes Chatzos, you can no longer eat the carbon, but it had a time in which it was permitted. So now that it's prohibited, is it still subject to the laws of breaking the bones? So the Gemara says, Lamanda Amar Kasher, HaKasher. So according to Mandam, who says that in order for the carbon to be subject to the laws of breaking the bone, it had to have been kosher. This was a kosher carbon. Lamanda Amar Lachila. But according to Mandam, who says that it has to be fit for consumption, Ha-hashta lav roi lachilahu. This carbon is not fit for consumption. Abayi says no. Kuli alma kiai gavna ein ba mishum shvirasa etzem. Abayi says that everyone would agree in this type of circumstance, which means what's this type of circumstance where the carbon was kosher, but now that it's possible, that now at this point in time that it's possible, it is not subject to the prohibition of breaking the bones. My time, what's the reason? hashta mias hapasul, because right now the carbon is pasul. Carbon is pasul. Excuse me. The Gemara says hashta. My time hashta mias hapasul ella shviras ha'etzmi be'od yom ikamer. Well, so listen to this interesting case. What's the nafkamina? The nafkamina is where you break the bone while it's still day. Remember, Rabbi say Karan Pesach is offered on the 14th, but yet what? You can't eat it until the 15th. So the shaila is there prohibition to break the bones on Erev Pesach, on the 14th, before Pesach starts? Liman da'amar kosher. So according to Antama, who says that any carbon that is kosher is subject to the laws of shviras etzma, breaking the bone, ha-kosherhu. This is a kosher carbon. But according to Mandam, who says that the Isser Shviras Etzem only applies to something that is fit for consumption, then what? Hashta lav bar achilahu. This carbon right now is what Rabbi say, not fit for consumption. Meisve, so one raises a kasha. Rebbe says, nimnin al moach sheberosh, ve'in nimnin al moach shebekulis. Rebbe says that again, when deciding which portions of the animals are fit for consumption, you can give someone a portion of moach sheberosh, literally the marrow of the head. That guy drew the short straw, right? So you give him the marrow of the head. Ve'ein nimnin al moach shebekulis, and you can't. But however, you can't go ahead and give out the portion of the marrow on the thigh bone. So the Gemara says, why is that? Listen to this. Al moach sheberosh my taima. Apparently, you can extract the marrow of the head through the nostrils of the animal. So you could scrape it out. You could, I'm kidding. And you could scrape it out from there without what? Without having to break anything. So because the marrow is accessible, you could do it. However, I'm sorry. Now the assumption over here, therefore, is what? Why can't you use the marrow of the thigh bone? Because the pashas, in order to get it, you have to break the bone. Now, what does that show you? And if you would think that the breaking of the bone while it's still day is permitted, then then if that's the case, then breaking the bone on Erev Yom Tov is okay because the animal is not yet fit for consumption. Then what? Break the bone, get the marrow, and let someone use it as their portion of the animal. Abaye was said to you, but using that logic, you know what? Rabbi could say, I could give you a different argument. Truth is, you should be able to go ahead and access that marrow at night as well. What can you do? Take a gumarta literally is an ember, like an ember or a coal. V'nechus alei, put it on top of the bone. V'nikla v'nafka lemoach didei v'nimni alei. The hatanya. Also listen to this because so Rabbi gives an interesting suggestion. Rabbi said the prohibition is to go ahead and break a bone. But let's say if I want to access the marrow, technically speaking, how I could do it, I could burn a hole through the bone. Burn a hole through the bone and get the marrow like that. Because after all, the hatanya avala sorif ba'atzamos v'amachanteich begidin ein bo mishum shviras ha'etzem. Because after all, the Brisa says that if you burn through a bone in order to get the marrow, or you go ahead and you cut through sinews, that is not considered to be a violation of breaking the bone of the Karan Pesach. Rather, what do you have to say? Abai Amar Mishum Paka. Abai says that the truth is we're actually concerned about allowing you to go ahead and use the marrow within the bone. Why? Out of a concern that even if you burn through the bone, we're concerned that you may end up cracking the bone. Because again, once you're burning through the bone, it's easy to think that you may come to crack it, and therefore that would be a prohibition. Therefore, Abai says that's why we don't let you use the marrow of the thigh bone for part of your Karban Pesach. We know you could access it, but we're concerned that in doing that you may end up cracking the bone. Rava says, you know why you can't burn through it? Mishum hefsid kadshim tikamafsid lebiadayim dilma achal nur mimoch didei. And Rava says what we're concerned is if we allow you to burn through the bone, you may end up what? You may end up not just burning the bone, but what? Burning part of the marrow also, in which case you are actively destroying part of the sacrificial item. And therefore, we don't want you to do this during the day as well. And we don't want you doing this during the day, lest you come to do it at night. Rav Papa says no. Rav Papa says, not true. In all of these cases above, there is a concern of shviras etzem. My timer, what's the reason? Li'arta nichze la'achila. Because in the evening, all of these items will be fit for consumption. So, for example, Rav Papa will say that yes, of course, the Karban Pesach, even during the day on the 14th, is still going to be subject to the prohibition of breaking the bone. Why? Because we don't just look at what the animal is right now; we look at what it will become as well, and it will become edible that night. Ella be'ever shiyatza miktasa kameflagi. So, what is the machlokes? The machlokes is in the following case. We'll say we know that if a Karban Pesach leaves the walls of Yerushalayim, the carbon is puzzle. The carbon is puzzle. What happens, however, if only part of the limb of the animal extends outside of the walls of the Beis Hamikdash? So half a leg extends out. Half a leg extends out. So say, listen to this. Man da amar kasher. So we'll say, now here's what we know. We know it's only the part that extends out that is inedible. The rest of the, let's say it's the leg that sticks out, the rest of the leg is edible. So the Gemara says, Man da amar kasher. So the one who says that in order to be subject to the laws of shiras etzem, the carbon has to be kasher. Ha kasheru. The carbon itself is still kasher. Uman da amar la'achila. And the man who says that it has to be fit for consumption. Hai lav barachilahu. This part that extended out is what Rabbosai is not fit for consumption. So what they're asking over here is, would the part that extended outside of the walls of the Beis Hamikdash or the walls of Yerushalayim be subject to laws of shiras etzem? So the Gemara says, Kid Sanya, after all we learned, Rabbi Shlomo Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka Omer. Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka said, Ever shetz miktsasal v'shavro, if you have part of a limb of an animal that extended, of a carbon pesach that extended out of Yerushalayim, and you broke it. So what did you do? You cut off the leg. You cut off the leg right where it extended out. Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Shmuel says, Ein bo mishum shiras etzem. There's no violation of breaking the bone. Rav Sheshes prayed, Rav Idi, Rav Sheshes prayed, Rav Idi says, Kol ki agavna, d'chuli alma ein bo mishum shiras etzem, dahai ever pasalhu. So it comes on Rav Sheshes and says, you're right, everybody agrees in this case, that lamaisa, if you broke the bone, from right where the leg extended out of your side, everybody agrees there's no shiras etzem there. Why? Because that particular limb, that part of the limb is possible. Elo shviras etzem beno ika benayu. Rather, what's the kasha will say? What happens if you broke the bone of an animal while it was still raw? You didn't cook it yet, while it was still raw. 14th. Mando amar kasher hakashu. So the man who says that any carbon that's kasher is subject to the laws of shiras etzem. This carbon is kasher. Umando amar roi la'achila. And the man who says that it's roi la'achila. Hashta eno roi la'achila. Right now, it's not fit for consumption. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says no. Kol ki agavna yesh bo mishum shiras etzem. Everyone agrees that when the carbon is raw, it is still subject to the laws of breaking the bone. Why? My taima dahachazi la'achila, because it will be fit for consumption. Dematfile va'achil, because ultimately when you roast it, it will be good. Ela shviras etzem ha'alya ikibinai. Rather, again, what's the machlokes? The machlokes over here is dealing with the fat of the tail of a lamb. The fat of the fatty tail of a lamb. So the Gemara says, "Lamand amar kasher hakasho." So the shaila is now that tail apparently has a bone in it. So the shaila is if you break the bone, are you chayiv? So the Ma'adam says that anytime the carbon is kasher, that's subject to the laws of breaking the bone. So this carbon is kasher. But according to Ma'adam, it says you only chayiv for breaking the bone on a part of the animal that's roi lachila. Hai eno roi lachila. This fatty tail is not roi lachila. Why? The alya ligavoa salka, because the fats are burned on the mizbeach and not consumed by any individual. Ravashi says, Kol ki agavna vada ein bo mishum shvirasa etzem. Ravashi says, no, everyone agrees that in this kind of case, meaning the fatty tail, if you break the bone, you're not chayiv. Why? Dahavada ein roi lachila klal, because this is not fit for consumption at all. Ella aver she'in alav kazayis basar ika benai. Rather, what's the machlokes? The machlokes is in a case of a limb that does not have a kazayis of meat on it. Limando amar, so a bone that doesn't have a kazayis of meat. Limando amar kasher. So according to Mando says that you're chayiv for breaking the bone of a carbon that's kasher. Hakashu, this carbon is kasher, and therefore you're chayiv for breaking the bone. Limando amar la'achila, but you know shir achila. But according to Mando says that it has to be fit for consumption. Or both saying, in order for a part of the carbon to be fit for consumption, the bone has to have a kazayis of meat. This one doesn't have a kazayis of meat, and therefore what? Therefore you should not be chayiv for breaking the bone. Ravina says no. Kol ki agavna less be mishum shiras ha'etzem. Ravina says no. Even in this kind of case, you are not chayiv for breaking the bone. Why? Because in order to be chayiv for breaking the bone in any particular place, it has to have a kezayis of meat, and this bone doesn't have it. Ela, Ever she'in alav kezayis basar b'makom zeh, v'yeshav kezayis basar b'makom acher ika b'nayif. So what's the machlokes case? I will say a case where you have a bone, and in the place where you broke the bone, there was not a kezayis of meat, but on another part of the bone, there was a kezayis of meat. Leman do amar kasher ha-kasheru. According to Mandam, who says that in order for it to be chayiv on bone breakage, the carbon has to be kosher. This carbon is kosher. Leman roi la'achila, ba'inan shirachila b'makom shvira v'haleka. But Rabbosai, according to Mandam, who says that it has to be roi la'achila, in order to be chayiv for breaking the bone, you require ultimately what? You require kezayis of basar in the place where the breakage is as well. All right, Rabbosai, we'll have to stop over here for today. A lot to do for tomorrow, Miras Hashem. But again, just to leave you, just to summarize this. So, what we have over here is the following. Interestingly enough, everyone is agreeing that lemaisa, if you go ahead and you break the bone of a carbon that's tameh, that you're pater for that. The only shayla is where you're learning it out from. So the two different drashas. One drasha says because you're only chayiv for breaking the bone of a carbon that's edible, and the other mandama says that you're only chayiv for breaking the bone of a carbon that is kosher. So all the Gemara is saying is, although it sounds like they're saying the same things, in reality, as we seen from this entire amid, there are many nafkaminas, many practical differences between those two particular opinions, and Miras Hashem will resolve the machlokes tomorrow.
Pretty good coffee.